Out in the Montana Territory, 1885, the wind didn't just bite, it gnawed right down to the bone. Snow fell in thick, heavy flakes, the kind that muffled the whole world in a blanket of white. But nothing could muffle the sound of a crowd holding its breath. They'd all come to see justice, or the frontier's rough version of it, packed shoulder to shoulder in the town square. Their breath rose in white clouds mingling with the falling snow. On the gallows, Samuel Reed didn't shiver. His hands were bound tight behind his back, the coarse hemp rope a familiar, scratchy weight against his neck. He was 35, but the sun and the trail had carved 2 decades more onto his face. He stood still as a stone pillar, his eyes scanning the crowd. He saw the shopkeepers, the miners, the farmers. He saw the well-dressed men who'd paid good money to hunt him down. And then he saw him. At the back of the crowd, a tall man with a beard as black as a dead fire and eyes that gleamed with a cold, hard satisfaction. Theodore Bear Blackwood, his old friend, his mortal enemy. Blackwood gave a tiny, almost imperceptible nod, a private message between 2 men who knew each other's souls. "Any last words, Reed?" The sheriff's voice cut through the hush. Samuel's gaze didn't waver from Blackwood. He knew what the man wanted. He wanted fear. He wanted a plea. He wasn't going to get it. Samuel's voice came out steady, a low rumble that carried across the square. "The Lord is my shepherd," he said, the words of familiar comfort. "I shall not want." The sheriff nodded to the hangman. The floor dropped out from under Samuel's feet with a sickening crack that echoed off the silent storefronts. The crowd gasped. A rope stretched taut. A body swung. But then came a sound no one expected. A sharp, loud snap. It wasn't the sound of a neck breaking. It was the sound of the rope. Samuel Reed hit the frozen ground beneath the gallows with a bone-jarring thud. He was stunned. The air knocked from his lungs. But he was alive. For a split second, the world was frozen in confusion. Shouts erupted. Witchcraft, divine intervention, orders to grab him. In that single chaotic moment, Samuel rolled under the wooden platform, scrambling into the maze of dark, narrow alleyways behind the courthouse. He disappeared into the falling snow like a ghost. That day, in the eyes of the law, Samuel Reed died. And 7 years later, in a lonely cabin in the Helena Mountains, a man named Ezekiel Morgan cleaned his rifle. 7 years, 7 winters, 7 years of looking over his shoulder. Smoke curled from the chimney of his cabin, a thin gray ribbon against a sky the color of slate. Inside, the fire crackled, casting long, dancing shadows on the log walls. Ezekiel Morgan sat at a rough-hewn table, the golden light of a kerosene lamp glinting off the steel of his Remington. His hands, calloused and strong, moved with a deliberate, practiced grace. Clean the barrel, oil the action, check the sight. This was his ritual, every single night. When the rifle was clean enough to see his face in, he set it aside. He pulled a worn, leather-bound Bible toward him. The book fell open to the same page it always did. Psalm 51. "Create in me a clean heart, O God." His lips moved, but no sound came out. The words were for him and him alone. Then he closed the Bible and pulled out a single sheet of paper. The scratch of his pen was the only sound in the room, aside from the fire. "Dear Rebecca," he wrote, "the snows came early this year. I dream of Dry Creek. I dream of your voice. They say time heals all wounds. They lie. Your brother, Samuel." He folded the letter carefully, not reading it back. He didn't need to. He held it to the flame of the lamp. The paper curled, blackened, and turned to ash. He dropped the fragile remains into the cast-iron stove and watched them disappear. Then came the final part of the ritual. He poured 3 fingers of whiskey into a tin cup, drank it in one harsh swallow, poured another, cleaned the gun, read the book, write to a ghost, drink until the memories went quiet. This was his life now. This was how he survived. He didn't know it yet, but his quiet, lonely world was about to be shattered. A storm was coming, but it wasn't a storm of snow and wind. It was a storm of flesh and blood, and it was heading right for his door. The next morning, Ezekiel rode his horse into Pine Crossing. The town wasn't much, just a handful of wooden buildings clinging to the side of a mountain. But it had grown. A general store, a saloon, even a small church. He tied his horse outside the store and nodded to Mrs. Peterson, the owner's wife. "Morning, Mr. Morgan," she said, her eyes a mixture of curiosity and caution. 7 years he'd been coming down from his mountain and he was still a mystery. The quiet man. The hermit. "Mrs. Peterson." "Ah." He touched the brim of his hat. "Need to post a notice." Inside, the store smelled of coffee, leather, and wood smoke. He pinned a small folded paper to the notice board, right next to an ad for lost cattle. "Help wanted. Cooking, washing, cleaning at mountain cabin. Good pay, no questions asked." He added his location, 3 miles north of Elk Creek Crossing, and stepped back. It wasn't the first time he'd posted a notice like this. The last 3 folks he'd hired hadn't lasted a month. The isolation got to them. Or maybe he thought it was him. The truth was, he didn't need the help. He needed the noise. He needed another voice in the cabin to drown out the ones in his head. "Looking for help again, Morgan?" Jacob Turner, the store owner, came up beside him. "Last fella you hired came back talking wild. Said you wake up in the night shouting some woman's name. Said you got a grave behind your cabin with no name on it." Ezekiel's jaw tightened. "A man's entitled to his privacy, Jacob." Of course," Turner said, backing off. "Just making conversation. Post came in yesterday. Got the monthly paper from Helena." Ezekiel had little use for news, but reading material was scarce. "I'll take it." As Turner wrapped the paper, Ezekiel's eyes fell on a wanted poster tacked to the wall. The sketch was crude, but the face was unmistakable. Harlan Weber, one of Bear Blackwood's most trusted men. "When did that come in?" he asked, keeping his voice casual. "Last week," Turner said, lowering his voice. "They say Blackwood's gang hit a stagecoach near Bitterroot. Killed 2 guards. Territorial marshals are offering $500 for Weber, $1,000 for Blackwood himself." Turner leaned in closer. "Between you and me, I hear Blackwood's got a book, a ledger, got the names of every official he's paid off from here to Denver. Judge, sheriff, you name it. They say that book is his real treasure." Ezekiel's heart hammered against his ribs. The book, the ledger. He'd always suspected it was real. He paid for the paper, his mind racing. On his way out of town, he stopped at the small telegraph office. He did this once a month, a coded message to a man he trusted. Marshal Daniel Collins in Helena. The message was always the same. Still looking. No sign of B. Will keep you informed. E.M. 7 years of searching. 7 years of listening to whispers in saloons. 7 years of waiting for Theodore Blackwood to make one wrong move. As he rode back toward the mountain, the wanted poster of Harlan Weber burned in his mind. $1,000 for Blackwood. Ezekiel didn't care about the money. He just wanted the man. He just wanted revenge. But revenge is a patient predator. And sometimes while you're hunting it, something else is hunting you. 3 days later, the storm hit. It came down from the north with a vengeance. A howling white monster that bent the pines double and buried the world in snow. Ezekiel was ready for it. He'd seen the yellow tinge in the sky, felt the shift in the air. He chopped extra wood, secured the cabin, and settled in for the long haul. By nightfall, the world outside had vanished. The wind moaned and shrieked, clawing at the log walls, trying to find a way in. Ezekiel sat by the fire, a book open on his lap, but he wasn't reading. He was listening to the storm, and he was remembering. Another storm, another time. A cave huddled with his little sister Rebecca. She'd been 12, scared of the thunder. "Why is it so loud, Samuel?" she'd asked. "So God can hear himself think over all our foolishness," he'd told her, repeating something their mother used to say. The memory was so sharp, so real, he almost missed the other sound. A dull thud against the cabin door. It wasn't the wind. Ezekiel was on his feet in an instant, the Remington in his hands. He moved to the window, peering through a crack in the shutters. A figure stood on his porch, hunched against the blizzard. A woman, alone, miles from anywhere in a storm that could kill a man in minutes. What in God's name was she doing out here? He cracked the door open, the rifle held ready but not aimed. The wind tore at the door, trying to rip it from his grasp. "Who are you?" he yelled over the howl. She lifted her head, and the lamplight from inside fell on her face. She was young, maybe late 20s, with cheeks hollowed out by exhaustion and eyes that seemed too big for her face. Her coat was worn and thin, completely useless against a Montana winter, and it was stretched tight over a belly swollen with child. I I saw your notice, she stammered, her voice nearly lost in the wind. In Pine Crossing. The notice. No questions asked. He hesitated for only a second before pulling the door open wider. Get in! She stumbled past him, bringing a swirl of snow and freezing air into the warmth of the cabin. Up close, he could see her boots were falling apart. She carried a single small canvas bag. He gestured to the chair by the fire. Sit. You're half frozen. She sank into it, her hands outstretched to the flames. He poured her a mug of hot coffee from the pot on the stove. Her fingers wrapped around the warm tin, and she winced as feelings started to return to them. You walked from town? In this? He asked, his voice rough. Started before the storm got bad, she said, not looking at him. I didn't think it would come so fast. She took a sip of the coffee. He watched her trying to piece it together. A pregnant woman alone walking into a blizzard to answer a stranger's ad. It didn't make any sense. Your husband? He asked, breaking his own rule. A shadow passed over her face, a flicker of pain. Dead, she said. Just the one word. He didn't push. The notice had been clear. He decided to ask a simpler question. What's your name? She finally looked up from the mug, meeting his eyes for the first time. They were a deep, startling blue. Rebecca, she said. The tin mug in Ezekiel's hand crashed to the floor. It shattered, sending scalding coffee splashing across the wooden planks. For a full 10 seconds he couldn't breathe, couldn't move. The name, that name, it hit him like a physical blow, knocking the wind out of him, stealing the air from the room. I'm so sorry, the woman said quickly, mistaking his shock for anger. I'm clumsy. I can clean that up. No, his voice sounded strange, distant, like it was coming from someone else. It's fine. You just startled me. He turned away, bending down to pick up the broken pieces of the mug, his hands moving mechanically. His mind was a whirlwind. Rebecca, of all the names in all the world, the wound he thought had scarred over was suddenly ripped wide open, raw and bleeding. After all these years, after everything, his sister's name, spoken by a stranger at his door. When he finally trusted himself to face her again, she was watching him. Her expression was hard to read. There was exhaustion, yes, but something else too. Something that looked unnervingly like recognition. Did she know? Was it possible? You can stay the night, he said, his voice clipped. Storm should pass by morning. We'll talk about the job then. She just nodded. Thank you, Mr. Morgan. He showed her to the small alcove off the main room. It was barely more than a storage space with a narrow cot, but it was private. He'd built it for his sister, Rebecca, for when she was supposed to come live with him. She never got the chance. Extra blankets in the chest, he said from the doorway. She set her small bag down. I've known colder, she said. There was a hardness in her voice, a survivor's edge that intrigued him. This woman was no simple victim. She was running from something, and she had run right to him. Why? Was it a coincidence? Or was it something else entirely? That night, for the first time in 7 years, Ezekiel broke his ritual. The gun stayed dirty. The Bible stayed closed. The letter to his ghost sister remained unwritten. He sat by the dying fire, turning a small gold locket over and over in his hands. Inside was a tiny faded picture of Rebecca at 16. His Rebecca. Outside, the storm raged on. But for the first time in a long, long time, the voices in his head were silent. They'd been stunned into silence by an echo. The echo of a name on a stranger's lips. And as he stared into the flames, a cold, unsettling thought began to form in his mind. There are no coincidences on the frontier. Not for a man with a past like his. He woke to the smell of coffee and frying bacon. For a split second, he was a boy again in his mother's kitchen back in Missouri. Then the cold reality of the cabin rushed back in, and he sat up with a start. He'd fallen asleep in the chair by the fire. The woman who called herself Rebecca stood at his stove, her back to him. She'd taken off her wet coat, revealing a simple gray dress pulled taut over her swollen belly. She turned when she heard him move. Hope you don't mind, she said. Seemed the least I could do. It's fine, he grumbled, getting to his feet. The storm had broken. Sunlight streamed through the window, so bright off the fresh snow it made him squint. They ate in a tense silence. She was efficient, organized, moving around his small kitchen like she'd been there for weeks, not hours. When the dishes were done, she sat across the table from him, her hands folded over her belly. "So," she said, her blue eyes fixed on him, "about the position." He studied her in the clear morning light. There was a faint, yellowing bruise on her left cheekbone, shaped like the knuckle of a man's fist. He'd seen marks like that before. He knew what they meant. "It's isolated up here," he said, testing her. "Nearest neighbor is 5 miles away. In the winter, the trails can be impassable for weeks." "I'm not afraid of being alone, Mr. Morgan." "Ezekiel," he corrected her. "And your full name?" "Clark," she said. "Rebecca Clark." He flinched inside, but his face remained a mask of stone. He looked at her belly. "When are you due?" 4, maybe 5 weeks. "I'm not a doctor, Mrs. Clark. If something goes wrong—" "I understand the risks," she cut him off. Her gaze was steady, unwavering. He saw it then. She wasn't just running from a ghost. She was running toward something. Toward him. The question was why. Every instinct screamed at him to send her away. She was a complication he didn't need, a risk he couldn't afford. But there was something in her eyes, a quiet desperation mixed with a core of steel, that reminded him of someone else, someone he'd failed to protect. "All right, Mrs. Clark," he said, against his better judgment. "You can start today." A wave of relief washed over her face, so quick he almost missed it. "Thank you." Later that day, after she'd settled in, Ezekiel went out to the small shed behind the cabin. He unlocked the door, pushed aside a pile of furs, and lifted a loose floorboard. Beneath it was a metal box. His old life. Inside was a wanted poster with the name Samuel Reed, a folded map of the territory covered in coded marks, and a yellowed photograph of 5 men standing in front of a saloon. A younger, clean-shaven Ezekiel stood on the end, and in the center, with his arms slung around Ezekiel's shoulders, was Theodore Bear Blackwood, both of them grinning like they owned the world. He took out one last thing, a letter from Marshall Collins, dated 2 years ago. "Morgan, your information on Weber's brother was good." He talked before they hanged him. "Blackwood's moving girls through Wyoming again. Still no sign of the book, but the rumors are getting louder. He's still looking for you. Be careful. D.C." He put everything back and buried the box. As he walked back toward the cabin, he saw her, Rebecca, Abigail, whatever her name was. She was standing on the porch, staring out at the mountains. The morning sun lit up her profile, and for a terrifying moment, she looked so much like his sister it made his chest ache. She turned as if she felt his eyes on her. Their gazes met across the snow, and in that silent moment, he knew with absolute certainty that her arrival was no accident. She hadn't stumbled upon his cabin. She had found it, and that meant she was either the most dangerous person he'd ever met, or she was in more danger than she could possibly imagine. The days settled into a strange rhythm. The woman who called herself Rebecca, he refused to think of her as anything else, was a hard worker. The cabin, already clean, started to feel like a home. There were small touches, a jar of pine branches on the table, curtains she made from an old blanket. He found himself talking more, sharing small details about his day. The silence in the cabin was no longer empty, it was comfortable. He learned things about her. She could read and write. She knew about herbs and remedies. But he never learned where she came from, who the baby's father was, or what had put that bruise on her cheek. She never asked him about his nightmares, or the nameless grave out back, or why he cleaned his rifle every night like a priest preparing for mass. They lived on the surface, two strangers, bound by a snowstorm and a secret, until the day she found the map. He'd come back early from checking his traps, a fat pine marten slung over his shoulder. The cabin door was ajar. An icy dread washed over him. Rebecca was too careful to be so careless. He dropped the marten, drew his revolver, and approached the cabin as quiet as a shadow. He found her at the table. His map, the one that should have been locked in the metal box under the shed, was spread out in front of her. "What are you doing?" His voice was harsh, colder than the winter wind. She looked up, startled but not scared. "It fell out of your coat pocket. I was mending a tear." He snatched the map off the table. "This is private. It's a map of this territory," she said, her voice calm. Too calm. I saw the markings, ciphers, and on the back, the initials SR, and below them 2 words, survived the hanging. The floor seemed to drop out from under him for the second time in his life. He stared at her, the cold, hard realization dawning. She hadn't just found it. She had been looking for it. "Who are you?" he demanded, his hand tightening on his revolver. The woman who called herself Rebecca stood up slowly, one hand resting on her swollen belly. Her blue eyes were filled not with fear, but with a grim resolve. "I know who you are," she said, her voice low and steady. "Samuel Reed." Their name hung in the air between them. A ghost he hadn't spoken in 7 years. A name no one left alive was supposed to know. "You've got the wrong man," he said, but the lie felt like sand in his mouth. "I don't think so," she said, holding his gaze. "I came here looking for you. My husband. My husband was William Clark. He ran with Blackwood's gang." Ezekiel's mind reeled. A trap. This was all a trap. "Are you working for him? Did Blackwood send you?" "No!" Her voice cracked with sudden, raw emotion. "I would die before I helped that monster. He killed William, shot him in the back for trying to leave." Her hand tightened on her belly. "Before he died, William told me stories. He told me about the legend of Samuel Reed, the only man Theodore Blackwood ever truly feared, the only man who ever got away." He sank into a chair, the strength gone from his legs. "I'm no legend, Mrs. Clark. I'm just a man who ran out of luck." "My name is Abigail," she said quietly. "My real name. And William didn't just tell me about you. He told me about the ledger." Ezekiel's head snapped up. The ledger. The book of names. He didn't know what was in it. "Not at first," Abigail continued, her voice gaining strength. "He was just a teamster. But then he saw things. He started putting it together. He realized Blackwood wasn't just an outlaw. He was building an empire, buying judges and politicians." William got scared. He wanted out. "He told me he'd made a copy of a single page, a page with the most important names on it, as insurance." She reached into a hidden pocket in her dress and pulled out a folded, worn piece of paper. She slid it across the table. He unfolded it. It was a list of names and dates and amounts. And at the very top of the list, a name that made the blood freeze in his veins. Marshall Daniel Collins. Collins. The man he'd been sending telegrams to for 7 years. The man he thought was his only ally. The man who was supposed to be helping him hunt Blackwood. He'd been feeding information directly to the enemy all along. Every move Ezekiel made, every whisper he passed on, had gone straight to Bear Blackwood. He wasn't a hunter. He was the prey, and he'd been walking right into the snare. "William stole this from Blackwood's tent the night he tried to run," Abigail explained. "Bear caught him. He killed him, but he didn't find the page. I did, in William's boot." Ezekiel stared at the paper, his world tilting on its axis. "Why come to me? What do you want from me?" Abigail leaned forward, her eyes burning with an intensity that startled him. "I want you to help me get to Oregon, where I have family. I want my baby to be born free from this. But before we go," she paused, taking a deep breath, "I want to see justice done. I want to see Theodore Blackwood pay. And I think that page is the bullet that can finally take him down." He looked at her. This woman, this stranger who had lied to him, who had sought him out, who now held the key to his past and the only possible path to his future. He should have been angry. He should have felt betrayed. But all he felt was a flicker of something he hadn't felt in years. Hope. "Blackwood will be looking for you," he said, his voice a low growl, "for that paper." "I know," she said, her hand resting on her belly, "but this child deserves a chance, and I think you deserve one too, Samuel." He looked from the damning list of names to the determined woman sitting across from him. She wasn't a complication. She was an opportunity, a chance to finally end it. "You can stay," he said at last. "You can stay, Abigail." That night his ritual changed. He cleaned the gun. He read the book. He burned the letter. But before he poured the whiskey, he took out the page from William's boot. He studied the names, the dates, and he started to make a new plan. The hunt was over. The war was about to begin. 3 weeks later, the baby came. It started with a storm, a real one this time. that slammed into the mountain without warning. Ezekiel had been out checking his trap lines and fought his way back through a blinding blizzard, arriving at the cabin just as dusk fell. He pushed the door open to a blast of warmth, and the sight of Abigail, braced against the table, her face a mask of pain. "It's coming," she gasped. "The baby! It's coming now!" "But you said babies don't follow schedules, Samuel." The next few hours were a blur of terror and chaos. The wind howled outside, a symphony of destruction. Inside, Abigail fought her own battle. He did what he could, boiling water, finding clean cloths, holding her hand. But he was useless, a helpless witness to a primal miracle. As the night wore on, her strength faded. "I can't," she whispered, her face pale with exhaustion. "I can't do it." He knelt beside her, his face close to hers. "Yes, you can," he said, his voice rough with emotion. "You crossed a mountain in a blizzard. You faced down the memory of Bear Blackwood. You are the strongest person I know. You can do this." The child was born just as the storm reached its peak, a tiny girl whose first cry cut through the howl of the wind like a promise. He wrapped her in a cloth and placed her in Abigail's arms. "A girl," he said, his voice thick. Tears streamed down Abigail's face. "Faith," she whispered. "Her name is Faith." Faith. The word echoed in the quiet corners of his soul. It was what he'd lost. It was what this woman and this child had brought back to his door. As he watched them, a memory surfaced, unbidden and sharp. Dry Creek, the robbery that had changed everything, the stagecoach on fire, the young girl he'd pulled from the flames, her face streaked with soot, her eyes wide with terror. He'd recognized her then, the daughter of the family who'd taken him in after a job went wrong, nursed him back to health without ever knowing who he was. And Blackwood, when he'd found out the girl could identify Samuel, had ordered her and her family killed. Samuel had warned them, helped them escape. And for that act of betrayal, Blackwood had taken his revenge on the only family Samuel had left. He'd taken Rebecca. The memory faded as the baby, Faith, made a small sound. He looked at the child, then at her mother, and for the first time he felt a purpose that went beyond simple revenge. It was about protection. It was about the future. He stood watch over them all night. He didn't read the Bible. He didn't need to. He prayed, a real prayer for the first time in 7 years, a plea for the strength to keep these two souls safe. Outside, the storm raged, but inside the cabin, something new had been born, and its name was Faith. As winter finally loosened its icy grip on the mountains, a fragile peace settled over the cabin. Faith grew stronger every day, and Abigail slowly recovered her strength. The cabin, once a fortress of solitude and grief, was now filled with the small sounds of a new life. They fell into a new routine, a quiet partnership. He hunted and chopped wood. She cooked and cared for the baby. They talked more, sharing small pieces of their pasts, building a bridge of trust across a chasm of secrets. One afternoon, he came back to find her standing by the nameless grave behind the cabin. "Who's buried here?" she asked, her voice soft. He stood beside her, looking at the simple wooden cross. "No one," he said. "It's for my sister, Rebecca. Blackwood, he killed her. Because of me. I never found her body, so I buried an empty coffin, just to have a place to remember." He told her everything then, about his years with Blackwood's gang, about the robbery at Dry Creek, about the fire, about the 7 years of guilt that had eaten him alive. She listened without judgment, her hand finding his. "I'm sorry, Samuel," she whispered. Her simple kindness was a balm on a wound he thought would never heal. But their peace was a fragile thing, a sheet of thin ice over dark, rushing water. A few weeks later, he returned from a trip to Pine Crossing with supplies and a telegram. He tried to hide it, but she found it in his coat pocket. It was from a contact he had, a man he trusted more than Collins. "Blackwood sighted near Bozeman, moving north with 6 men. He knows about the woman. He's hunting you. Get out now." "When were you going to tell me?" Abigail asked, her voice tight with fear. "I didn't want to worry you." "I need to learn to shoot," she said, her jaw set. "Properly. I will not be helpless again. I will not let him take my daughter." So he taught her. He started with the revolver, showing her how to load, aim, and fire. She was a natural, her hands steady, her eyes clear. By the end of the week, she could hit a tin can from 20 paces. It was on a clear, cold morning in late April that their world shattered again. He was splitting wood when he heard hoofbeats. 2 horses. He grabbed his rifle and moved to the corner of the cabin, watching the trail. A woman appeared, riding a gray mare, a young boy of about 10 on a pony behind her. "Can I help you?" he called out, his hand on his revolver. The woman reined in her horse. She was around 40, her face weathered, her eyes sharp and intelligent. "Looking for Ezekiel Morgan." "Who's asking?" "My name is Eleanor Hayes. This is my son, Lucas." The name meant nothing to him, but there was something about the boy's face, a flicker of familiarity that he couldn't place. Just then, Abigail came to the door, Faith in her arms. Eleanor's eyes widened in shock as she saw Abigail. "Clark?" she whispered. "William Clark's wife?" Abigail went pale. "How do you know my husband's name?" A tense, heavy silence fell over the yard. Eleanor's expression hardened. "Because I was William Clark's wife first," she said, her voice flat and cold. "And this," she put a hand on the boy's shoulder, "is his son." The revelation hit Abigail like a physical blow. She staggered back, gripping the doorframe for support. William had another family, a wife, a son. The man she had loved, the man she had mourned, was a liar. Ezekiel moved to her side, his mind racing. This couldn't be a coincidence. "What do you want here?" he demanded of Eleanor. But it was the boy Lucas who answered. He looked straight at Ezekiel, his eyes old and solemn in his young face. "My mother sent us," he said, his voice small but clear. "She said you were her brother. She said her name was Rebecca." Ezekiel stared at the boy. It couldn't be. Rebecca was dead. He'd seen the flames. He'd mourned her for 7 years. "My mother is dead," he said, his voice a harsh rasp. "No, she's not," the boy insisted. "She's alive. She's a school teacher in a town called Silver Creek. She sent us to find you. She said Bear Blackwood found out she was alive. She said you were all in terrible danger. His sister, alive." The world spun, the ground unstable beneath his feet. Rebecca was alive. For 7 years he had been mourning a ghost. For 7 years his entire life had been built on a foundation of grief and vengeance for a death that had never happened. Before he could even process the news, Eleanor spoke again, her voice urgent. "That's not all. We were followed. Blackwood's men. They're close. They know you're here." Suddenly it all clicked into place. Blackwood wasn't just hunting him for the ledger page anymore. He was hunting him for Rebecca. He wanted to finish the job he'd started 7 years ago. He wanted to destroy Samuel's entire world. The sound of a twig snapping in the woods behind them was the only warning they got. A rifle shot cracked through the air, splintering the wood of the cabin door, inches from Abigail's head. They were trapped. Chaos erupted. Ezekiel shoved Abigail and the baby back inside the cabin, yelling for Eleanor and Lucas to get down. More shots rang out from the tree line. Blackwood's men, they were surrounded. "How many?" he yelled to Eleanor. "4, maybe 5. I saw them on the ridge this morning." He peered through a crack in the wall. The men were moving through the trees, closing in. They were pinned down. He had Abigail, a newborn, another woman, and a boy who barely knew how to hold a gun. The odds were impossible. "There's a loose floorboard in the back room," he said to Abigail, his voice low and urgent. "Under the bed. There's a tunnel. It leads out to the creek bed. Take the baby and go. Now." "I'm not leaving you," she cried, her face streaked with tears, but her hands steady as she reloaded the revolver he'd taught her to use. "You have to," he roared. "Get Faith to safety. Get her to Rebecca. Tell her I'm sorry." Just then, the front door burst open with a splintering crash. Harlan Weber stood there, a cruel grin on his face, a pistol in his hand. "Nowhere left to run, Reed." Behind Weber, more of Blackwood's men poured into the small cabin. Ezekiel fired the Remington, the blast deafening in the enclosed space. One man went down, but there were too many. He saw Eleanor go down, a dark stain spreading across her dress. He saw Lucas, cornered, his face a mask of terror. Ezekiel fought like a cornered animal. He was a whirlwind of motion, the rifle a blur in his hands. But he was just one man. A pistol butt crashed against the side of his head, and the world exploded in a flash of white-hot pain. He staggered, falling to one knee. Through the ringing in his ears, he heard Abigail scream. He looked up just in time to see Weber grab Abigail, holding the pistol to her head. Faith started to wail, a terrified, piercing cry. "It's over, Reed," Weber snarled. "Bear wants you alive. He wants to have a nice, long chat with you, and with your sister." The world went dark. He woke up on the floor of his own cabin, his head throbbing. His hands were tied behind his back. Abigail was across the room, tied to a chair, her face bruised and swollen. Faith was in a makeshift cradle, crying fitfully. Lucas was nowhere to be seen. Theodore Bear Blackwood sat at Ezekiel's table, casually cleaning a knife with a rag. He looked older, his beard streaked with gray, but his eyes were the same, cold, black, and empty of mercy. "Well, look who decided to wake up," Blackwood said, his voice a low rumble. "We have so much to talk about, Samuel. You and me." "Where's the boy?" Ezekiel rasped, his throat dry. "Lucas? Oh, he's safe," Blackwood said with a chilling smile. "My men are taking him on a little trip, a reunion. We're going to Silver Creek. We're going to pay your sister a visit. And you, Samuel, you're going to take us there." The threat was clear. If Ezekiel didn't cooperate, Lucas and Rebecca would pay the price. "What do you want, Bear?" "What do I want?" Blackwood leaned forward, the knife glinting in the lamplight. "I want what you took from me. I want the ledger page. That little piece of paper your woman's dead husband stole. The one that proves Marshall Collins is on my payroll." So that was it. Collins was panicking. He'd sent Blackwood to clean up the mess, to retrieve the evidence before his world came crashing down. "I don't have it," Ezekiel lied. Blackwood laughed, a harsh, ugly sound. "Don't lie to me, Samuel. I know you. You'd never destroy something that valuable. Now you're going to tell me where it is. Or I'm going to start with her," he nodded toward Abigail, "and then I'm going to ride to Silver Creek, and I'm going to burn that schoolhouse to the ground with your sister and your nephew inside." Ezekiel stared into the eyes of the monster he had helped create. He was trapped. There was no escape. But as he looked at Abigail, at her defiant, unbroken gaze, he knew he couldn't give up. He had to find a way. "It's not here," he said, his voice steady. "I buried it, near Dry Creek, where it all started." It was a desperate gamble, a lie. The page was still hidden in the cabin. But he needed time. He needed to get Blackwood out of the cabin, away from Abigail and Faith. Blackwood studied his face for a long moment, then nodded slowly. "All right, Samuel. We'll take a ride. Just you and me. Back to where it all began." He knew it was a death sentence. Blackwood would never let him live once he had the page. But it was the only chance he had. A chance to lead Blackwood away. A chance for Abigail to escape. A chance, however small, to save the family he had just discovered he had. As Blackwood's men hauled him to his feet, he locked eyes with Abigail one last time. He tried to tell her everything with that one look. "I'm sorry. Be strong. Run." She just gave him a tiny, almost imperceptible nod. He didn't know it then, but Abigail had a secret of her own. A secret hidden in the heel of her boot. A small, sharp knife. She wasn't waiting to be rescued. She was planning to do the rescuing herself. The ride to Dry Creek was a journey through hell. Blackwood kept Ezekiel on a short rope, literally tied to his saddle horn. They rode hard, stopping only to water the horses. Ezekiel's mind raced, searching for any opportunity, any weakness, any chance to escape. But Blackwood was a careful man. He was never out of arm's reach. "You know, I never wanted to kill Rebecca," Blackwood said conversationally as they rode. The words a poisoned arrow aimed at Ezekiel's heart. "It was business. You betrayed me, Samuel. You helped that family at the stagecoach escape. You cost me. There have to be consequences." "That family was innocent," Ezekiel bit out. "There are no innocents in this world," Blackwood said with a shrug. "Only survivors. A lesson you never seemed to learn. You were always too soft, always letting that conscience of yours get in the way." They arrived at the burned-out ruins of the old cabin at Dry Creek as the sun began to set. painting the sky in shades of blood and fire. The place was a ghost, a skeleton of charred timbers against the darkening landscape. "All right, Samuel," Blackwood said, dismounting and pulling Ezekiel from his horse. "Where is it?" Ezekiel's heart pounded. This was it, the end of the line. He had to stall. He had to pray that Abigail had gotten free, that she'd found a way to get help. "It's buried," he said, looking around at the ruins. "Under the hearthstone." Blackwood's eyes narrowed. "You're lying." "Why would I lie now?" Blackwood thought for a moment, then grunted. "Fine. Start digging." He untied Ezekiel's hands and threw a rusty shovel at his feet, but kept his pistol trained on him. Ezekiel started to dig, his muscles screaming in protest. The ground was hard, rocky. He worked slowly, deliberately, buying every precious second he could. He thought about Rebecca. He thought about Lucas. He thought about Abigail and Faith. He dug his own grave, and he prayed for a miracle. And then he heard it, a faint sound on the wind, the sound of hoofbeats, a single rider, coming fast. Blackwood heard it too. He spun around, pistol raised, a curse on his lips. A lone figure on a dark horse crested the hill, riding straight for them. It was a woman. Her face was grim, determined. Her hand held a rifle. It was Abigail. Blackwood let out a roar of rage. "You were supposed to be tied up." "You underestimated me," Abigail called out, her voice clear and steady. She reined in her horse a safe distance away, the rifle aimed squarely at Blackwood's chest. "Just like everyone else does." In that split second of distraction, Ezekiel acted. He swung the shovel with all his might, catching Blackwood squarely in the side of the head. The man staggered, dropping his pistol, a look of shocked surprise on his face. Ezekiel dove for the gun, but Blackwood was faster. He recovered, launching himself at Ezekiel, his massive hands closing around Ezekiel's throat. They rolled in the dirt, a desperate, violent struggle. Blackwood was stronger, fueled by rage. Ezekiel was weakening, the world starting to go gray around the edges. He could hear Abigail shouting, the crack of her rifle, but she couldn't get a clear shot. Blackwood's face was inches from his eyes burning with a triumphant hatred. "This is the end, Samuel," he snarled. "I should have done this 7 years ago." And then another sound. More riders, a lot of them. They came over the hill like an avenging army, a posse of armed men. And at their head were two figures, a man with a sheriff's badge gleaming on his chest, and a woman with dark hair and familiar, intelligent eyes, a faint scar tracing a line down the side of her face. Rebecca. Blackwood's head snapped up, his eyes widening in disbelief. That single moment of shock was all Ezekiel needed. He drove his knee up into Blackwood's groin. The big man grunted, his grip loosening for just a second. Ezekiel twisted free, grabbing a jagged rock from the ground and bringing it down on Blackwood's temple. The outlaw collapsed, unconscious but alive. Ezekiel stumbled to his feet, breathing heavily, and stared at the riders. His sister was here, alive, real. She slid off her horse and ran to him, her arms wrapping around him in a fierce, desperate hug. "Samuel," she whispered, her voice choked with tears. "I thought you were dead." "I thought you were," he breathed, holding her tight, unable to believe it was real. Later, as the sheriff's men hauled the unconscious Blackwood and the recovered ledger page away, the story came out. Rebecca had survived the fire, saved by one of Blackwood's own men who had a crisis of conscience. She'd spent years in hiding, recovering, believing Samuel was dead. When she heard rumors of a man named Ezekiel Morgan, a man who fit her brother's description, she'd sent Lucas and Eleanor to find him. Abigail had escaped the cabin minutes after Ezekiel had left, cutting her ropes with the hidden knife. She'd found their horses, ridden like the wind to Silver Creek, and found Rebecca and the sheriff, leading them back for the final confrontation. Marshall Collins, exposed by the ledger, was arrested. The empire of corruption he and Blackwood had built crumbled to dust. Weeks later, on a warm summer evening, Ezekiel sat on the porch of a small house in Silver Creek. Rebecca's house. He watched Lucas teaching Faith how to skip stones in the creek. Abigail sat beside him, their newborn son, a baby they named Hope, sleeping in her arms. It wasn't a simple ending. There were scars, both visible and invisible. There were ghosts that would likely never fully fade, but as the sun set, casting a golden glow over the valley, Ezekiel felt a sense of peace he had never known. His quest for revenge was over. He had lost his sister and found her again. He had found a woman who was his equal in every way. He had a family, a strange, broken, beautiful family, forged in the fires of the Montana frontier. He was no longer Samuel Reed, the outlaw. He was Ezekiel Morgan, a father, a brother, a husband, a survivor. The past was a part of him, but it no longer defined him. He had finally found his clean heart. He had finally found his home. What a ride, right? An incredible story of betrayal, survival, and the kind of redemption you only find at the edge of the world. It just goes to show you that even in the darkest of times, there's always a glimmer of hope. If you enjoyed this story and want to hear more tales from the strange, dark, and mysterious corners of history, do me a favor and hit that subscribe button. And don't forget to ring the notification bell so you don't miss a single episode. Thanks for hanging out with me today, and as always, stay safe out there.